All right, let's get right into it. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to break down one of the most uncompromising, high-stakes pieces of legislation you will ever encounter. The Control of Narcotics Substance Act of 1997, or as we'll call it, the CNSA. We're going to navigate through this incredibly complex web of prohibitions, look at the absolutely massive powers granted to the police, and examine the incredibly severe punishments this law enforces.
But before we get into the granular, nitty-gritty details, let me ask you a question. Just imagine for a second, what if the fundamental rule of justice was flipped entirely against you? In most areas of criminal law, the burden of proof rests totally on the state. But under the CNSA, the stakes are terrifyingly different.
Think about it. In standard criminal law, the doctrine is crystal clear. You are innocent until proven guilty. But take a look at Section 29 of the CNSA. Under this law, once the police prove you had active possession of a narcotic, boom, you are legally presumed guilty. It literally becomes your job to prove your innocence in court. It's a massive, massive shift. And keeping this in mind is absolutely crucial as we explore the rest of this statute.
Okay, let's dive into Section 1, Prohibitions and Punishments.
The CNSA leaves absolutely zero breathing room. None. Section 4 outright bans cultivating cannabis, coca, or opium poppy plants, unless you have a very specific government license. And from there, it's a total blanket ban. Sections 6, 7, and 8 outlaw possessing, importing, exporting, and trafficking these substances. It even goes a step further. Section 10 makes it a serious crime to simply own or operate the premises, or even just the machinery used to extract or manufacture these drugs. Basically, if you touch the narcotics trade at any level, you fall under these sections.
Moving right along to Section 2, Penalties based on weight.
What's really striking here is how mathematically precise the law becomes. Under Section 9, punishments scale up strictly based on weight. So 100 grams or less, that might get you up to 2 years under Section 9A. But jump to 9B, which is anywhere between 100 grams and a kilogram, and suddenly you're looking at up to 7 years, plus a fine that's actually tied to the drug's quality. And then there's Section 9C, more than 1 kilogram. This is where the stakes hit the absolute ceiling. We're talking life imprisonment with a mandatory minimum of 14 years, or even the death penalty, right alongside a massive 1 million rupee fine.
But there is a very specific threshold you need to be aware of, and that number is 10. If the quantity of the seized narcotics exceeds 10 kilograms, the courts are completely stripped of their leniency. No exceptions. The absolute minimum sentence becomes life imprisonment.
So, you might be wondering, how are these strict weight-based penalties formalized in actual day-to-day practice? Well, enter the landmark Ghulam Mortaza case from the Supreme Court, cited as PLD 2009 SC 362. This is the definitive ruling here. This case thoroughly summarized and structured exactly how the Section 9 sentencing guidelines must be applied across the courts, ensuring that the quantity and the quality of the drugs strictly dictate the severity of the punishment.
Let's shift gears to Section 3, Police Powers and Investigations.
To enforce such extreme penalties, the police are granted extraordinary, honestly, almost terrifying authority. Under Sections 21 and 22, the police don't necessarily have to sit around waiting for a magistrate's warrant. They can enter, search, break open doors, and arrest suspects day or night. Now, they do have to record their reasons for this, like, say, preventing an escape or stopping the destruction of evidence, but they can act fast. They can stop and search you in a hotel, a park, on public transport, you name it. And Section 31 gives them the sweeping power to compel anyone to produce documents or hand over information. The legal leash on law enforcement here is remarkably loose.
And get this power extends globally through controlled delivery operations under Section 24. Picture this. Authorities detect a massive drug shipment coming from Japan to Pakistan. Instead of swooping in and seizing it immediately, they can just let it pass through. They track it with undercover agents for up to 3 months. The goal? To follow the drugs all the way up the chain to the top of the syndicate, completely dismantle the network, and gather undeniable evidence along the way. It's straight out of a spy movie. But here is where things get highly controversial. Normally, under the standard criminal procedure code, the police are absolutely required to have private, civilian witnesses present during a search and recovery. But Section 25 of the CNSA, it throws that rule completely out the window. The police can conduct a drug bust and rely entirely on their own officers as witnesses. However, the higher courts have really had to push back on this to prevent abuse. In a lot of rulings, courts have stated that if the police have prior information,
They conduct a raid in broad daylight in a busy public place, and they deliberately fail to even attempt to include private witnesses. Well, that creates serious doubt. And as we know in criminal law, serious doubt regarding a defective investigation leads directly to acquittals.
Which brings us to Section 4, the presumption of guilt.
Let's explore the actual mechanics of a CNSA trial, because the flow of this process is wild. Step 1. The police must first prove they recovered the drugs from the accused's active possession. Step 2. A narcotic testing laboratory has to scientifically confirm the substance is indeed illegal, and they actually must test proper samples from every single packet seized. Okay, so only once the state proves those two things does Step 3 activate. And this is the kicker. The burden of proof shifts entirely onto the accused. You are now presumed guilty, and you have to prove your own innocence.
So what exactly does active possession actually mean? It means direct, conscious control. If the drugs are literally in your pocket, yeah, that's active possession. But what if you're just sitting in a shared taxi, minding your own business, and the police find drugs hidden under a seat? Well, unless the prosecution can prove you were actually aware of those drugs and had control over them, that is not active possession. This subtle distinction right here is where the absolute fiercest legal battles in CNSA trials are fought.
All right, finally, let's look at Section 5, asset freezing and forfeiture.
Because the state doesn't just want to take away a criminal's freedom, which leads us to a massive question. What happens to the properties, the fancy cars, the sprawling bank accounts bought with illicit drug money? Under Sections 12, 13, and 37, the law is completely merciless.
Here's the timeline of how a suspected drug trafficker loses literally everything. It happens fast. Immediately upon suspicion, investigating officers can freeze assets for up to 3 days. In the short term, a special court steps in to confirm that freeze. This makes sure the accused can't just sell or transfer the property while the trial is ongoing. And finally, upon conviction, specifically if the sentence is 3 years or more, Section 39 steps in and those assets are permanently, officially forfeited to the state.
And if you think a smart criminal can just hide the money by putting it under a family member's name, think again. The law extends its reach. Any assets acquired through drug trafficking that have been transferred to relatives, friends, or associates will also be actively traced, frozen, and forfeited. There is simply no legal loophole for keeping the profits of this trade. The whole shebang gets seized.
As we wrap up this explainer, we really have to recognize the immense moral weight the legal community wrestles with here. Yes, the law is incredibly harsh, and absolutely we must avoid falsely implicating innocent people. But, as the courts have repeatedly noted, we also cannot allow minor legal technicalities to save individuals who are quite literally destroying future generations with narcotics. So, I'll leave you with this one final, really difficult question to ponder. How do we effectively balance such extreme, unyielding law enforcement powers with the constant, real-world danger of a defective investigation? It's an incredibly fine line between necessary strictness and potential abuse. Thank you so much for joining me to break down the CNSA 1997. Keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.